Hello. We come to the last of our 22 classes, unfortunately for me, um, on the history of early Christian thought. And this provides us an opportunity to think back on what we've seen and also to make some other observations that um, we haven't really made along the way and that ought to be brought forward um, before we're completed. So we'll take a look at Hall's last chapter and those selections that I suggested for you to read, which you will notice are very different than the ones that we have normally done before. They don't so much support the chapter as show us different things. More about them in a minute. I sent you 3 book lists to go along with this talk, and I'd like to say something about them before we begin. The first one I called Some Books on the Teaching of the Early Church. I have lots of books, as you can see. Lots of people I know have lots more, though my wife doesn't believe that. But of the making of books, there is no end, and there are lots of books around and lots of books that are out of print but still around. There are many things to study if you're interested in the early church and its thought and its life and its art. There are many different things that I could suggest to you. We live in the best age, certainly since the fall of the Roman Empire, which say since the death of Gregory the Great, which is 610 AD, to know about the early church. As a matter of fact, I think I may have said this before, but it's true and it's worth saying again. In some ways, we can know more about the early church than they knew about themselves. For one thing, we can know about the breadth of the early church in a way that no one who was in the early church could. Once you get past people like St. Paul, founding churches and traveling around to see how they're doing, Christians, wherever they're born, pretty much stay in one place, as human beings have in every culture except our own right up to the present day. But we can know something about the early church in Spain and in England and in Gaul and in North Africa and in Italy and in Greece and in Asia Minor and in Egypt, etc. And people who lived in the early church couldn't. They didn't know as much about what other Christians were doing as we do. There are certain things we know very little about. We know very little about early Christian worship, certainly very early Christian worship we know very little about. We know very little about the details of their practice, in the sense that we don't have prayer books, we don't have liturgy books, we don't have descriptions of what they did during Lent. Stuff like that comes quite late in the period that we've been looking at. Really in the later 300s it begins to survive. But service books don't really survive until centuries later than that. So the most basic parts of Christian corporate experience are unknown to us. But we do know a certain amount about dogmatics, about the details of their theology. And so that tends to be what people look at, because we have the information to look at surviving to us. So if you look at this, Some Books on the Teaching of the Early Church, Kelly's 2 books, Early Christian Creeds and Early Christian Doctrines, are absolute standards and classics of scholarship. Early Christian Doctrines is quite dense. I would not suggest for someone to read it until he or she had done something like we just did, because you now know what's going on in the early church. You could actually read Early Christian Doctrines, which is not endlessly long, but it seems to be designed more as a way to kind of review things than as a way to learn them for the first time. So you might read it with profit, but if you handed it to your spouse and said, "Here, read this, I think it's so interesting," that would be a bad idea. I have not made that mistake in my marriage. I've made others, but that one I recognize from a long way away as not being useful. John Meyendorff's book, Christ in Eastern Christian Thought, begins during the patristic period and carries up to quite late in the life of the church. It is a classic work, a brilliant work of scholarship, and it will tell you quite a bit about the patristic period, and as a matter of fact, quite a bit about Eastern Orthodoxy. If you want to learn how they think, that's a very good book to take a look at. Gerald O'Collins' book, The Tripersonal God, I could also have put in his book on Christology, both of which contain very important historical sections. I should probably put in this, his Christology book, in a later version of this list, just because they're very useful and excellent books, and he does a good job of explaining the history of doctrines. Prestige's two books, Fathers and Heretics and God and Patristic Thought, are absolutely classic works in this field. The Fathers and Heretics are studies on particular people, and the God and Patristic Thought is more synthetic. God and Patristic Thought is one of those books that everyone who's seriously interested in the development of Christian thought should read, because it's really a classic description and analysis of that, written by an Anglo-Catholic. So, why not? There aren't all that many of us around, so we need to support each other, even though he's long gone. These last two books I put in. Proctor's book, What Think Ye of Christ, which is actually a reprint of a much earlier book, contains two long chapters on the development of the doctrine of the Incarnation that I used to use when I taught Christology. I think they're very good compressions, descriptions of the kind of stuff that we've been doing in shorter form, 20 pages or so each, so maybe 40 pages or 45 pages total. You can buy it on the internet for $1. I just bought one for $1. And if I could find it, I'd show it to you. But anyway, because mine was worn out, so I bought a new one, a new old one. And Thatcher's book, as a last one, has a title that might scare us off. But Thatcher's basic point is, we used this at the seminary in the 90s, shortly after it came out. Thatcher's point is, he says, if you get up to the Council of Chalcedon, which we have just done, and this is something to think about, Thatcher says, if you work your way through early Christian thought about Christ, as we have just done, he says, what the church is really trying to say is that Jesus is truly a person, a human person, and truly God at the same time. He says, we have in some ways a very different idea of what it means to be a person than than the ancient world did. They want to talk about nature and essence and stuff like that. And we think psychologically and experientially, what's it like to be a person is, to go through the kind of stuff that we all go through. And he says the church doesn't say that at Chalcedon because, they're talking about essence and substance, right? But that's what they're trying to say, is that Jesus is what we are, and Jesus is also the Son of God incarnate. So he says, now that we live in a culture and a time which in some ways has a more advanced understanding, certainly a different understanding, of what it is to be a person, that's how we need to think about Jesus, not in terms of substance and essence, but in terms of, he's a person, and that's how we can try to understand him. And so I would argue that it's a very orthodox, traditional work trying to talk about very orthodox traditional things in a completely modern way, which is what theologians are called to do. So I think it's an interesting work and a good work. And when we read it at seminary, it wasn't just me. When we read it at seminary, people liked it. So, it comes, is that better? It comes with, that looks kind of like Halloween, doesn't it? It comes with the blessing of not just me, but other people who were in the province and read it. So I suggest that to you as a very modern, in some ways a very modern attempt to do something very traditional, which is a good thing. Those of us who are trying to be theologians in the church need to understand that every generation of the church needs to um, theologize for itself, and we need to do that for our generation. That's one of the things we're called to do, and that's what Thatcher's trying to do. So that's a good thing, I think. This last thing, Grillmeyer's multiple volumes. These are big doorstop books, every one of them, all five. Um, this is your desert island reading for Christology. If you really want to understand Christology, then, or if you really want to read through early Christology with modern help from a great scholar, the first volume there, volume one, From the Apostolic Age to Chalcedon, if you buy that and read it along with the individual people, it is extremely enlightening. He's a German, so it has all of the snappiness and succinctness of German scholarship. In other words, it goes on and on forever, and it's as dry as dust. You will wash your mouth out with sand afterwards to give it a little moisture. But everything's in there, and it is a classic work. I think it's maybe finally done. The last one finally came out in 2013, and I think they're finally done. So anyway, that's that list. Some books on the early church east of the Roman Empire. One of the last things I want to leave you to think about today, we're going to look at this later, is that Christianity is an Asian religion. It begins in Asia, Palestine's in Asia, and it grows first in Asia. We Europeans tend to think of it as a European religion. That is incorrect. It is not a European religion and never has been. It seems perfectly. I used to teach a class on the spread of the church in Asia. So I've thought about this some. And in the last 100 years, there's been an explosion of knowledge among people in the West about the church in the East. It is certain that at the time of the First Crusade, which is in the 1000s, right, the 11th century, at the time of the First Crusade, the Middle East itself, the heart of Islam, right, was still majority Christian. And it seems quite likely that up until about the year 1400, statistics are always impossible even today, but certainly back then, it seems very likely that up to about the year 1400, middle 1400s, there were always more Christians east of Jerusalem than there were west of Jerusalem. In other words, what we think of as a European religion, because that's how we get it, was, as a matter of fact, majority Asian for its entire history. Up to about 1450, Tamerlane did a heroic job of trying to rid Asia of Christians, killing millions and millions and millions of them. And he had lots of help from his fellow followers of the religion of peace. And the church, which was very extensive in Asia for all of its history, was almost wiped clean, except in certain places like India and Persia where it survived. Armenia. But then, of course, with the age of modern missionary work, which begins in the very early 1500s, right, with the Jesuits, maybe the 1550s, there is maybe a century there between 1450 and 1550 where the church in Asia is very small and scattered, and then it begins to grow again exponentially with the rise of modern evangelism. It's very important to remind yourself that the first two Christian countries were Armenia and Ethiopia, and they still are, right? They're still both Christian countries. We think of what we do as, I'm an Anglican, like you all, and I'm an English Christian, and we think Christians are mostly like us. But as a matter of fact, they're not and never have been. We now live in a world where the church is mostly of the third world. What will happen? This has never been true before. You could buy yourself a dozen books every day on Amazon for a long time before you ran out of books talking about that question. And it's completely false. The church has always been mostly the third world. And it is again, too. We're just kind of realizing it. That's the difference. So, in order to know about the history of the church, you have to know about the history of the church outside of what we ourselves have actually looked at. Because we have looked at the kind of Western spread of the church. And as far as this goes, Greeks are West. We always talk about them as the Eastern Orthodox. And they're Eastern if you're where we are, but they're Western in the history of the church. Sorry, I could tell you lots of interesting stories about. When we used to live in California, and we were going to visit my folks in Boston for vacation, and I said to some of our friends, we're going back east, and they said, "Oh, Reno?" I mean, your idea of east and west depends on where you're from. I didn't think of Reno as east, even if it was east of me. Okay, so these books, the 2 volumes by Moffat, History of Christianity in Asia, volumes 1 and 2, those are excellent books written by a man who taught at Princeton Theological Seminary at the end of his life. He was raised in China, child of missionaries. His first language was Chinese. I met him at a conference. He was in his 90s and still teaching. And I met him and told him, I've developed this whole course for undergraduates using your books and everything. We had a very nice talk. And he said, Paul, someone asked me once, what's it like to pray, to pray the Lord's Prayer in Chinese? It must be so wonderful and exotic. And he said to them, I still have to work very hard and usually have a book to say it in English. Then, the only way I know it, as a good Presbyterian minister, the only way I know it is in Chinese. He said, that's what I know, Anyway, so he's a very good person to talk about the church in Asia because that's what he's all about. John Foster, who was a Scotsman, was also a child of missionaries, first language Chinese. His book on the Church of the Tang Dynasty is a little thing. It's still one of the best to read. You can find it used on the internet sometimes. If you ever see it, grab it. I had a copy and I gave it away and it never came back, so I'm still lurking. Sidney Griffith's book, The Church in the Shadow of the Mosque, about Christianity in the world of Islam. Sidney Griffith is the greatest American scholar on the history of Arabic language Christianity. A graduate and professor at my university. He was one of the directors of my dissertation. A very wonderful Christian man. And that's a very good book. Wilmshurst's book, The Martyred Church, is the most recent book on the history of the Church of the East that we used to call Nestorians but shouldn't anymore. And if you want to see pictures of what it's like, you read Baumer's book from 2006, An Illustrated History of Assyrian Christianity, and that will tell you about that. There are oceans more stuff. If you want more, send me an email and I have a 30-something page, I believe, bibliography that I used to give to students. And that'll keep you going. The last list I wanted to send you is, what's the point? Why do Christians study the history of the church? Why do we study theology? Why do we study the history of theology? Because we think that it will have some effect on our religious lives, on our understanding of how to pray and what it means when we pray. Hopefully that it will have some effect, hopefully a positive one, on the Christian attempt to draw closer to God, which is what religious life is and is for. And so setting aside all of the doctrine stuff, I made a list of things, mostly from the early church, 2 pages from the early church, but then a few medieval things and some modern things. Spiritual reading, if you want to do spiritual reading. The life of Anthony that we've heard so much about. Early Christian biographies, that volume has the biography of Augustine in it and a biography of Cyprian. Both of them eyewitness accounts, fascinatingly. Some Desert Fathers stuff that we talked about. Gregory the Great, some gospel homilies that will show you that preaching is preaching. Gregory of Nyssa's book, On the Lord's Prayer and the Beatitudes is a wonderful book, very accessible. It reads as if it were written for a modern audience. It shows that Christian life is Christian life. Gregory, writing in the 300s, is just as accessible to us in the 2000s as he was 17 centuries earlier. Jacob of Sarug on the second page on the Mother of God, wonderful things on Mary. If you would like to read about Mary, Jacob of Sarug was a scholar in the Syrian Orthodox tradition. Very good to read a non-Chalcedonian author and realize what I was trying to argue last time, which is that they're really our brothers, even though we are at odds with them, tragically. Some good Origen stuff, his Exhortation to Martyrdom, and his work on prayer, which is the earliest Christian work on prayer that survives. And then three people's works on the Lord's Prayer, Tertullian, Cyprian, and Origen, in one little book. It's a wonderful thing to have. The three, I believe these are the three earliest works that survive on the Lord's Prayer. And again, they all read, to my mind, I mean, maybe you're different from me, but they all read, to my mind, as though they could be written for a modern audience. Everybody should read some Bonaventure. Everything else aside, he was one of the kindest saints in the history of the church. Everybody loved, his real name was John, but everyone called him Bonaventure, which means welcome, right? Think about that as being your religious nickname. Everybody loved Bonaventure, and you'll love Bonaventure too. He's really a wonderful person. And then you get some modern things. William Law's book, A Serious Call to a Devout and Holy Life. If there were a single book that sort of helped spark the Oxford movement, it's William Law's book. So powerful that John Keble used to keep his copy locked in his desk drawer because he didn't want any of the young guys reading it without supervision, because he thought they would sort of, jump off a cliff. It's very wonderful stuff. And these other things. Theophan the Recluse, who lived lived right at the same time as Teresa, the little flower, the wildflower, Teresa of Lisieux. You read his stuff, he's living in Russia right before the revolution. You read his stuff, and he sounds more old-fashioned than Gregory of Nyssa, which may explain a lot about Russia. But anyway, interesting things. So you can enjoy yourself with those, and I hope they're helpful. Let's say a few things about the heritage of ancient theology before we start to look at the original sources for the day. It is very interesting, as Hall points out, that in important ways the Church, certainly in the Roman Empire, and so therefore the Church that we inherit, gets a lot of its organizational outline and even vocabulary, things like diocese, from the Roman imperial administration. There's a lot of ways in which the way we run the Church, and this is Greek Orthodox and over, is really much more Roman than it is anything else. It's hard to argue. People get very worked up about ecclesiology, and I mostly don't get worked up about ecclesiology. I think, in an age when you have to argue with people about the existence of God, I'm not so worried about ecclesiology. But ecclesiology is something which is certainly affected by the environment in which Christians live. And it's important for us to understand that living in the Roman Empire made a tremendous difference in the way that the Church organized itself. And the Church in other places like Persia and farther east, we'll see a little bit of that later, in a non-Roman environment, organized itself quite differently. Not as differently in some ways as they had bishops, priests, and deacons, and monks and nuns, and they were all praying the Lord's Prayer and trying to love their neighbors as themselves and stuff. In some ways, no difference at all. But they had a different idea, sort of how things worked. This thing here on doctrinal development, this is, of course, a very hot topic. In an age in which the historical study of Jesus is very popular, Um, Many scholars have tried to argue that developed Christianity has no essential connection with original Christianity, that Christianity turned into something else as it grew. Um, and people like Harnack, the great scholar of the history of the church, who thinks that dogma is the work of the Greek spirit on the soil of the gospel and a bad thing, um, represent that point of view. And then there are other people like us and like Cardinal Newman and like everyone who takes seriously, I would say, um, the words of Christ in the Gospel of John, where he says, I will send you another comforter and he will lead you into all truth. If you take the Gospel of John seriously, we expect that the church's knowledge and life will advance and develop. That's what we've been promised, and that's certainly what we experience if we look back on the history. Um, it's a very different thing to say that doctrine develops and doctrine changes. Certainly, I mean, what I usually say if people ask me is that the church's dogma stays the same. Dogma means things that are given, right? I would say a given thing, for example, once you have Chalcedon, a given thing is that Christ is truly a person, truly God, as we were saying, right? That's a given. You start with that. But the givens, I would say, tend to stay the same, but the doctrine, which is what you teach, what you actually say and how you go about it, that, of course, changes over time. For one thing, in the early church in the West, the real West, the Latin West, people preached in Latin, and now they don't anymore because people don't understand it. So the language changes, but of course the language, even inside languages, if you read Cotton Mather's sermons, which you can, and they're interesting, people don't preach like that anymore. We don't have 4 hours to sit in church, but also we speak differently, and we explain doctrines differently, and we have a different understanding of history, and we have a different understanding of our place in the world. And so all of these things affect how we go about trying to say what is essentially the same thing, which is one of Thatcher's main points and why that's an interesting book. Cardinal Newman, who of course began his life as an Anglican priest, wrote this probably the most famous work on the development of Christian doctrine, certainly in the English-speaking world, called The Development of Christian Doctrine. I didn't bother to put it on the list. It's in print in umpty million different editions because it's long out of copyright. If you just put John Henry Newman into Amazon, it'll light up, and you'll have all sorts of choices. His basic argument is that there is an organic logic in Christian thought that like an acorn growing into an oak or a seed growing into a corn plant, the nature of the beast controls the way it grows, but it does grow. If you don't understand the nature of the beast, and if you don't watch it grow, then if you put a seed in the ground and went away and came back a year later and there's this tree, you would be surprised because you wouldn't know what to expect. And by looking at the tree, you would not be able to tell this used to be the acorn, right? But if you watch it grow, you can see it's developing its own internal life force and nature. And so what's happening is a natural thing. It's not turning into something else. It's becoming a more full version of itself. That's Newman's basic approach to explaining the development of Christian thought, which we have been tracing for 22 weeks. And I would have to say that seems to be the basic approach that the early church takes too. As Hall points out, early Christian theologians like Gregory Nazianzus in the Theological Orations very, very firmly says that the church grows in knowledge. He says, for example, Scripture itself is a progressive revelation. He says in the Old Testament, the Father is shown us clearly and the Son implicitly. In the in the Gospels and the New Testament, the Son is shown openly and the Spirit implicitly. And then in the life of the church, carrying on even beyond Scripture, he says in the life of the church is where we experience the Spirit implicitly in a Trinitarian context. So we begin to see how all the pieces fit together. That's a very traditional argument, and it's not, in its basic logic, really different from what Newman is trying to say, which is, of course, why Newman was saying it, right? Because he'd read that too. I find that intellectually satisfactory, and I also find that to fit with the basic tenor of Scripture and to fit with the basic Christian understanding of what it is we're doing and what it is other Christians have done in earlier ages and how those things go together while not necessarily being the same. I don't need to think that Athanasius or Augustine or Cyril or Tertullian or Origen or anyone else thought exactly the way I think to think that I agree with them. Right? I can agree with them while living a different life, thinking in a different language, having different experience, and trying to explain the church's thought to a very different group of people than they did, and not think that I'm disagreeing with them. And I don't think that that's an intellectual stretch, and I also don't think it's dishonest. But in order to even think about these kinds of things, so first of all, this is one of the benefits of studying the history of Christian thought. We can now talk about this in a way that would have been impossible for us to do 22 weeks ago before we began. Because at this point, having gone through all this stuff and seen all these things, we're all on a different page than we were before. I really do think that the result of, in the process of studying the development of Christian thought, is transformative for a Christian person's self-understanding of him or herself as a Christian, and a self-understanding of the church as a broader institution and of where we stand in history, all those things. I think it's very important. Okay. Here on page 242 and going on from there, it's very interesting that Hall ends this whole book, which is, about the church. He ends it with a section called the biblical basis. In the end, as a number of American Protestants have discovered in the last couple of generations, and they're finally turning to study the early church. The early church was an evangelical operation. It was deeply scriptural in its basis. And the arguments were scriptural, the thinking was scriptural, the prayers were scriptural. Their whole approach was to try to live in the Bible and live out the Bible and live out its teachings, which I think, in the end, I think, as far as that goes, I think Christians are all Protestants. We're all Bible people. But I also think, in the end, Christians are all Catholics. We're all tradition people. And sometimes Protestants try to deny the tradition side, and sometimes Catholics try to deny the Bible side. Neither one of those things works very well for very long. You get real deformations of Christianity if you try to hold back from parts of that balance. You've really got to have the balance. And I think, among other things, that this course has argued for the balance. And I think that's a good thing. That's a very important basic Christian message. So now let's turn to selection 229. I can only kind of point these things out to you, but it's too bad we can't go through the book selection by selection, both of these things, because it would be wonderful to do that. If you were to read something next, and your wife had told you not to spend any more money on books, like some people I know, then the first thing I would suggest to do would be to go back to the beginning of a new Eusebius and read that together with creeds, councils, and controversies from beginning to end, to see the narrative. I think that's a very good exercise But I wanted to show you a few things that we had to kind of skip over. Vincent of Lorraine, in his work called the Commonitorium, which is sort of something you hand to someone, like a thing to jog their memory when they don't have you around anymore, where he talks about, studying history and tradition in addition to Scripture. Look at the first page here, page 371, the second paragraph. Here perhaps someone will ask, since the canon of Scripture is complete and in itself self-sufficient, and more than sufficient on all points, what need is there to join to it the authority of ecclesiastical interpretation? If you got the Bible, that's a good... In other words, there were clearly good Baptists in Gaul in the 400s, right? Well, if we got the Bible, what do we need else? And Vincent says, the answer, of course, is that owing to the very depth of Holy Scripture itself, all do not receive it in one and the same sense, but one in one way and another in another interprets the declarations of the same writer. So it seems possible to elicit from it as many opinions as there are men. He says, so if you look down to the bottom 3 lines after this list of people, whence it is most necessary on account of the great intricacies of such various errors, that the rule for the interpretation of the prophets and apostles should be laid down in accordance with the standard of the ecclesiastical and Catholic understanding of them. You have to know how the church reads the Bible in order to get it the way you want it. Also, here at the top of 372, this is the famous punchline quote everyone gives you from Vincent. In the Catholic Church itself, we take great care that we hold that which has been believed everywhere, always, by all, for that is truly and properly Catholic, which comprehends everything almost universally. Catholic means according to the whole. If you really want to be a Catholic Christian, you got to take in the whole tradition. In other words, is what he's saying. Now, of course, we know, and I think he knew too, that you can never actually know what everybody in the church thinks. He's talking about as much of the church as we can know. If you introduce into the church, for example, the idea that Jesus was not really a human being but just looked like one, it's clear to see that that's not something which has been acceptable in the Christian tradition. As a matter of fact, that's something which has been rejected over and over again. It's not a Catholic idea. Right? It's not a traditional idea. That's what he's basically on about. You can be guided by that with the help of others. Fine. We've only got 22 more minutes, so let's keep on going. Number 232 here, Leo preaching on the authority of the Roman Church. Notice that Leo puts forward the idea that because Rome is the place where where Peter was in charge of the church, Rome is therefore the head of the Christian operation. In other words, he's arguing on a purely religious basis. And the next one here, 233, also argues that, interestingly enough, that the world is divided among the 12 apostles, and Peter gets, Rome. So since Peter's the chief of the apostles, Rome is the chief of the church. This is a legend that is suggested a number of times in different places in the early church. The Eastern Christians, east of the Roman Empire, suggested that Thomas, doubting Thomas, got them in the East, and so they often refer to themselves as the Thomas Christians, the followers of Thomas, about which there's a whole lot more to say, but we can't say much about that now. It's interesting that Leo's attempt to try to, claim that he's in charge of everything, is he puts it forward on traditional grounds. Valentinian, the emperor, if you turn to 234, says something different. It's interesting. Rome becomes important in the Western Empire clearly because the emperor wants to use Rome to control the church in the Western Empire. Look at what Valentinian says here. Our empire is the only defense. Our empire's only defense is in the favor of the God of heaven. We need God to favor the empire, right? And to deserve it, we need to support the Christian faith. So, inasmuch then as the primacy of the apostolic see, by which of course he means Rome, which is the only apostolic see in his part of the empire, is assured by the merit of St. Peter, prince of the episcopal order, by the rank of the city of Rome, first among cities, right? And also by the authority of a sacred synod. It's difficult to know exactly what synod, but so therefore he mandates that the church in Rome should be the focal point of the church. It's interesting. He says it's the merit of Peter, the rank of the city of Rome, and the authority of a synod. You notice that Leo doesn't like that selection of things. He likes the the primacy of Peter. That's great. The rank of the city of Rome he doesn't like because it's social and civil, and the authority of the synod he doesn't like because if the synod has the power to make Rome the center of the church, then the synod logically could have the power to make some other place the center of the church. The power would then reside in the synod instead of in Rome. So one of the things we see there, actually in the contrast between 234 and the two before, this is the beginning in the West, the very beginning of the argument between people who say the Pope runs the church and people who say councils run the church. And the argument continues to the present day. You can have very uncomfortable lunches in the faculty lounge of a Catholic university if you throw this fox in among the chickens. And that's been true for centuries. So as someone who is not involved in this, I think I don't have to settle this quarrel. I do not think that the Pope is in charge of the church. Certainly not the way Leo thinks he is, or I guess, who is it now? It's Francis. Not the way Francis thinks he is. But I don't have to worry about it. It's not my problem. But something to know before we turn quickly to look at the Eastern Church. The text, which is, in all the years that I've had to sit through people fighting about this, anyway, it's like sitting in a room where the Mets fans are fighting with the Yankees fans, and I'm from Boston and I think the Red Sox are great. You just kind of wait for it to blow over. But the passage that everybody uses is, thou art Peter, on this rock I will build my church, and that what you bind will be bound in heaven, what you loose will be loosed, that whole thing, the power of the keys, which is where the keys and the papal symbol come from. It's very important to understand that as far as we can tell now, universally in the early church, that passage was not read as saying something about Peter among the apostles, but rather something about the apostles and the church hierarchy. In other words, in the early church, that was the passage by which people argued that the church has the power to, for example, forgive sins and pronounce absolution when people confessed. That Peter was standing as an individual representative of the entire church, not as an individual representative of himself. And then his presumed followers in the See of Rome afterwards. It's only when you get to people like Leo and Gregory after him who are arguing for their own papal authority that passage begins to be read as being about Peter as an individual and his successors as later individuals. It's very important to know that fact. So anyway, let's turn from that and just say a few things about the Eastern Church, the Oriental Church, as you could say. Selection 3, if we go all the way back to page 4, persecution in Persia around 340, the martyrdom of the Catholicos of Persia. The Catholicos is the traditional title for the head of what we call the Church of the East. He's the Catholic bishop, the bishop of the whole thing, right? There's still a Catholicos who used to live in Baghdad, but that's a bad idea. He now has fled to a monastery, I believe. The head of the Syrian Orthodox Church is called the Mafrian, and there's one of them too, and he also lives in northern Syria, I believe. Very bad days for these folks. Well, here we are. Okay, we're going again. So the interesting thing here, of course, is that Sapor, the emperor, knows where to get at the Catholicos, calls him in, and Simeon tries to explain himself. What you see, interestingly enough, the Christians seem to essentially be persecuted because they are thought to be representatives of Rome and a kind of fifth column present inside the country, which is why the emperor thinks it's so important to try to get a public acknowledgement from the head of the body of allegiance to him and to the native religion of the Persians, which is Zoroastrianism. This is why over and over again the church in Persia is in such difficulty. They're persecuted as a religious group for what are clearly political reasons. They are considered to be politically suspicious in Persia. And this is why, for example, here in the next selection, 59, on page 87, the Synod of Ashtashad, where they are coming together. This is Armenia and Persia, which are very closely connected, both outside the Roman Empire, right? They are getting together to decide how they are going to organize their lives, and they're having to do it. They're still searching. If you look, let's see, 3, 6. Look 5 lines down. The ancients, ordinarily the ancients summoned synodal assemblies to deliberate on the reestablishment of order in the church and on the unity of the faith. Christians in Persia and Armenia are trying to do the same thing the ecumenical councils are, just in a very more different and more generally hostile environment. And so their general goal is to try to organize and regularize Christian life, but they have to do it apart from the Christians in the Roman Empire, because if they were at the Council of Nicaea, there is in fact a bishop from Persia, and it becomes quite clear soon afterwards that that's a tremendous internal political mistake for him to show up at the Nicene Council. It makes life very difficult for Christians in Persia for a generation or two after that. And this is the problem. Here in selection number 196, Yazdegerd, a different king of kings, Shah, than we saw before, actually earlier than the one we saw before, is trying to talk to talk to the Christians and see what they're really up to. And Marutha of Mifrkot, one of the great names in Christian history, has come from the very eastern part of the Roman Empire to try to help people get organized. And this is after the council in Constantinople, but before the Council of Ephesus. 410 is, and you see here at the top of page 293, they express the deepest sentiments of loyalty to the king. That's the king of Persia, right? They accept the contents of the Western letter advising them, on general ways how to organize their church, on the method of appointing bishops, the regulation of Christian festivals, how to decide when it's going to be Easter, is what they're usually worked up about, and on the acceptance of the canons of Nicaea. They accept specifically the Nicene Creed, which seems to have been the Constantinopolitan Creed, is what we would call it, because their creed does not differ from ours. This is them doing it separately, accepting the Nicene Council, but you notice as a separated body outside the empire. And you notice that right away, the next, you turn the page, and now Yazdegerd begins to wage war against the Christians. It's back and forth. Terrible persecution. They're terrifying martyr acts. The Acts of the Persian Martyrs is a great thick collection, parts of which have been translated into English a number of different times, and they're horrifying stories to read. They're much crueler and much more interested in torture than the Romans were, because of course they, everything else aside, they thought that they were really allies of their great enemies, the Romans. They're not just sort of internal rebels; they're traitors, and so they were treated accordingly. It's very interesting. The number 198, Amida, is Diyarbakir, is what it's called now. A city in east central Turkey. I've been there. It's beautiful. There have been horrible massacres of Jews and Christians there in the last 100 years. They've gone from 9 churches down to about, when we were there and met them 10 years ago, there were about 7 Christians left with 1 priest. But it was at this point just inside the Roman Empire, and you notice that the Bishop Acacius of Amida, which was a very well-to-do church and a very well-to-do community, sold the church silver, the church plate, in order to help the needs of Christians fleeing from Persia. So there is a very clear sense of Christians being all in it together and trying very hard to look after their brother Christians. Persian, Roman, doesn't make any difference. The church it's a recognition that the church is a universal thing. Just before we look at the last thing, why am I beating this dead horse? Because these are exactly the groups, the Church of the East and the Syrian Orthodox, the Copts in Egypt, the Armenians, the Ethiopian Orthodox, some of the people in India. These are the groups from which we are still separated by our acceptance of Chalcedon and their non-acceptance of Chalcedon. Some of those groups, like the Syrian Orthodox in particular, have rejected Chalcedon, and talks with them are slightly different, though I would say also, as I said last time, it seems perfectly clear that their Christology actually agrees with ours, though they have rejected Chalcedon as an official way of saying it. But the Church of the East, which has never been presented with the Council of Chalcedon as something to either reject or accept, is a non-Chalcedonian church in the sense that it hasn't accepted Chalcedon, but it's not non-Chalcedonian in the sense that it's rejected it, right? They're sort of parallel, and that's why, though there are very good theological reasons for accepting communion with both the what we would call the Monophysite stream and the Church of the East, for historical reasons, the Roman Catholic Church has been much readier to accept the Church of the East rather than the Monophysite stream. Though I think there are not doctrinal reasons to disagree with either of them. I think it's perfectly clear that both of their, if you think back to what we looked at last time with the definition of Chalcedon, marking out boundaries in which Christology must be located, and I think that it is perfectly clear now that if we understand it properly, the way the people who express it understand it, that both the Church of the East's traditional Christology and the Monophysite Church's traditional Christology are in fact inside the bounds that Chalcedon sets up. But that's not something that priests worry about. That's a bishop problem, I'm glad to say. So that's not something I need to worry about. We end with the Synod of Dadisho, which is a declaration on the part of the Christians in the Persian Empire that they make formal canons stating that they will be an independent body in and of themselves, and that they will not allow official rulings, jurisdiction, to move from the church to the West into them, and from them into the Church of the West. In other words, they separate themselves off in order to be able to function and survive. This is the church that 200 years later than this, 620s, right at the time that Augustine is arriving in Canterbury, the first official delegation of Syriac language Christians is arriving in Xi'an, the capital of China. So that's something that's worth knowing too. That at the time that the Latin Catholic Church comes back again officially into the British Isles, the Church of the East has reached all the way to China, all the way to the eastern coast of Asia. So they spread much more rapidly and much farther than the church did in Europe, though of course the church spread and contracted and spread and contracted and stuff with the waves of barbarians coming in. But that's a good place to end, with our minds thinking about the fact that the church is present in China. Church of the Tang Dynasty, that's John Foster's book. The church is present in China within a decade of the time that Augustine comes to Canterbury. Very close in time that our brothers and sisters in Christ from East Asia go back as far as we organized Latin Christians in the British Isles, not like the Celtic Christians who really don't exist anymore, though some people romantically try to be Celtic Christians. We Latin Christians from the British Isles have our beginning at the same time as our brothers and sisters in Christ in the capital city in the Chinese Empire. And, the gospel spreading far and fast and being rooted quite deeply. There are Christians from that original spread still in India, for example, millions of them, that can trace their beginnings back to the very early spread of the church in their part of the world. And so we've come a long way. I hope that you found this as interesting as I have. I've enjoyed myself a great deal. I don't get to talk about these things as much as I would like to. And I'm very grateful for all of you for your time and effort in following this course of study and making it all the way to the end. We've done, if you look back over what we've done a great deal. and I hope that you have found it interesting as well as time-consuming. And I look forward to being in contact with you in the future. I have things to send you, and I hope you will ask me anytime I can help you.